Emily was just 8 years old when the storm swallowed her world. Her aunt and uncle had driven her out into the rain, clutching nothing but a tattered teddy bear and leaning on Blaze, her father's old German shepherd. The sky wept as she stumbled through the night, and when hope seemed to have slipped through her small hands, headlights cut through the rain. Officer Daniel Hayes spotted her at the gate, soaked and trembling, unaware that by stopping his cruiser, he was stepping into a story that would reshape his life. A story of broken hearts mended, of secrets unearthed, and of a family pieced together not by blood, but by faith and love. Willow Creek that day carried a weight in the air. Clouds pressed low against the rooftops, muting the little town into a wash of gray. The Parker house stood near the edge of the road, its paint long faded to a weary shade, shutters creaking in the restless wind. It looked as if the years had carved the same tiredness into its wood as they had into those who lived within it. Inside, Emily sat on her narrow bed, legs drawn close, a stuffed bear clutched tight in her arms. Her light brown hair curled from the dampness of the day, framing a face too young to carry eyes that heavy. They were wide, blue, and hollowed by grief, eyes that seemed too old for a child. Since the accident that stole both her parents, she had spoken sparingly, guarding her words like fragile glass, as if one wrong sound might cause the last bit of stability in her life to splinter. At her side was Blaze. 10 years had carved silver into his muzzle and brushed his sable coat with threads of white. But time had not dimmed his stature. He moved with the quiet command of a sentinel, ears always tuned, eyes carrying the weight of a loyalty that had not faltered. To Emily, Blaze was more than her father's dog. He was her shield, her companion, and the last piece of her father's presence she could hold on to. But to the Morrisons, Emily's aunt and uncle, she and Blaze were burdens. Linda, her mother's sister, bore a beauty polished on the surface and bitterness underneath. To others, she appeared gracious. But within her home, her patience ran thin, her words clipped sharp. In her sister's shadow, she had long simmered with envy, and now that resentment had found a new target in Emily. Carl, her husband, carried the bulk of a laborer's life on his shoulders, his face worn and ruddy from exhaustion. He wasn't cruel for sport, but he was practical, and in his mind, the girl and her dog were little more than mouths his table didn't need. Their son Dylan, just 11, mirrored both parents in looks, but carried something harsher in spirit. He delighted in poking at Emily's quiet nature, sneering at Blaze, and treating them both as intruders. His cruelty was subtle when his parents watched, sharper when they looked away. That evening, Emily found herself in the backyard, the hem of her dress damp with grass still wet from rain. She pressed her face into Blaze's fur, the scent of earth and age grounding her. The wind hissed through the fence, and in its whisper she imagined her father's voice, soft, steady, reassuring. Blaze lifted his head as if he too had heard it, pressing his nose to the cracks in the wood, listening to a world just beyond their reach. Emily touched his shoulder. "You hear him too, don't you?" she whispered. Blaze returned to her, leaning against her with silent devotion. The creak of the screen door cut through the quiet. Linda's voice snapped across the yard, brisk and sharp. "Emily, dinner." Now Emily rose quickly, Blaze following at her heels, but as they stepped into the doorway, Linda's eyes narrowed. Her voice thinned. "The dog stays out." Emily hesitated, her hand tightening on Blaze's collar. "He won't—" Carl's voice cut her off, low and final. "Rules are rules. He doesn't belong in here." Blaze's ears pricked, his gaze fixed on Emily as she knelt, stroking his head. "Wait for me," she whispered before closing the door between them. He let out a low whine before settling on the porch, his body a silent shadow in the night. Dinner was a quiet storm. Carl ate without a word, the scrape of metal against plate grating in the silence. Linda stared at her glass, her resentment unspoken but heavy. Dylan smirked across the table, flicking peas onto Emily's plate, leaning closer when no one was looking. "Your mutt's probably ripping up the porch," he muttered. Emily shook her head, voice barely a breath. "He's not." Dylan's grin widened. "You don't belong here?" "Neither of you do." Linda's sigh broke the tension. "Enough. Eat." But she didn't scold him further. She never did. Each bite Emily swallowed felt heavy, each moment stretched only by the thought of Blaze waiting just beyond the door. When the house finally settled into its evening routine, Emily slipped out to the porch. The stars had broken through, faint glimmers in the torn clouds. Blaze's head lifted at the sight of her, his tail thumping softly against the boards. She wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his fur. "You're all I have," she whispered. He licked her cheek, steady and warm, pressing close as if to promise he would never let her go. That night, when Emily pulled her thin blanket over her shoulders, Blaze ignored the rules and padded softly into her room. He settled at the foot of her bed, his breathing slow, his eyes watching over her. She drifted into sleep with her hand resting on his back, unaware of how quickly the fragile balance of her world was about to break, and how Blaze's loyalty would soon be tested in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The backyard looked cheerful on the surface, with neat hedges and a pool that shimmered under the sun, but the brightness couldn't mask the unease that pressed against Emily's chest. For her, the pool wasn't a place of play. She had never learned to swim. Her father had once promised to teach her, a promise cut short by the accident that took him away. The sight of the water still unsettled her, a reminder of summers that would never come. Dylan, though, saw the pool as his stage. At 11, his lanky frame hadn't yet grown into itself, his pale hair plastered to his forehead in damp strands. His grin always seemed to carry something sharp, and in Emily, he had found the perfect target for his games. "Come on," he called, his voice sugar-coated but laced with command. "It's too hot." "Let's go by the pool." Emily hesitated, glancing at her faded dress, then at Blaze, who stood firm at her side, ears pricked forward, his silvered muzzle catching the light. Blaze shifted, muscles tense, as though he already sensed the danger hidden in Dylan's words. Emily gave him a small pat before stepping toward her cousin. From inside the house, her uncle's voice carried through the open window, low and steady on the phone, speaking of long shifts and delayed deliveries. There would be no help from him. And Linda, upstairs behind drawn curtains, had left Dylan free to weave his mischief. The pool sparkled deceptively, blue and inviting, its surface hiding Emily's dread. Dylan leaned against the edge, splashing casually. "See? Nothing scary. Everyone can swim a little. I don't want to," Emily whispered, her voice nearly lost in the hum of the filter. She clutched her teddy bear tightly until the nearness of the water forced her to set it down on a chair. Blaze immediately stationed himself beside it, guarding what she could not carry. Dylan's grin stretched wider. He stepped closer, his hands gripping her shoulders before she could move. "Don't be such a coward." With a sudden shove, the world tilted. Emily fell forward, her scream breaking apart as the water swallowed her whole. Cold and suffocating, the pool closed around her. Bubbles blurred her sight, panic clawed at her lungs. She thrashed, reaching blindly for the edge, her small arms fighting against the weight of her soaked dress. Blaze surged into motion, claws scraping the patio as he barked furiously, circling the water, teeth bared. He lunged at Dylan, his paw knocking the boy back, his jaws grazing Dylan's arm. Dylan yelped, stumbling with a shallow scratch streaked across his pale skin. Gasping and coughing, Emily managed to cling to the slippery edge, hauling herself halfway out, trembling. Blaze planted himself at her side, barking with a fury that shook the air, his body a shield between her and Dylan. The back door creaked open. Linda appeared, dish towel in hand, her hair perfectly pinned despite the heat. Her eyes narrowed instantly at the scene. Dylan clutching his arm, Emily dripping wet, Blaze growling low. "Mom!" Dylan cried, his voice breaking just enough to sound pitiful. He pointed at Blaze, twisting the moment to his advantage. "He attacked me!" Linda swept down the steps, red sandals clattering against the stone. She pulled Dylan to her, inspecting the faint scratch as though it were a grave wound. Emily's words spilled out in gasps, water dripping from her hair. "No, Dylan pushed me. Blaze was only trying to help." But Linda's glare cut her off, cold and unyielding. "Don't lie, Emily. That dog is wild. He's dangerous. And now you've put Dylan at risk behind her mother's shoulder." Dylan smirked, his eyes glinting with victory. Emily's heart hammered. Blaze growled, hackles raised, standing immovable in front of her, his body stiff with defiance. She pressed her hands against his back, whispering, "It's okay, Blaze. Please." But he would not back down, sensing her fear, his bark echoing across the yard. Linda's voice rose, sharp as a whip. "Get that animal inside before I call the shelter." The neighbors peeked from behind fences, murmuring but unwilling to interfere. Tears streaked Emily's face, mingling with the water still dripping from her hair. She tried again, her voice trembling. "He saved me. Dylan pushed me." "Enough," Linda snapped, dismissing her niece's pleas without hesitation. She turned her focus back to Dylan, stroking his hair as if he were a wounded hero. "Go inside, sweetheart." "I'll take care of this." Dylan shot one last mocking glance at Emily as he strutted toward the house, cradling his arm with theatrical exaggeration. Blaze's growl rumbled deep in his chest, fading only when the boy disappeared inside. Linda lingered on the patio, arms folded tight across her chest, her stare cutting into Emily and Blaze like a blade. The air was thick, the buzz of cicadas filling the silence, thunder murmuring somewhere far beyond the hills. Emily clung to Blaze, her sobs muffled against his fur. The dog stood still, his steady breath pressing into her side, as if he had taken it upon himself to shoulder her pain. No punishment came that instant, but the house felt colder than it ever had before. Night fell heavy over Willow Creek. Clouds rolled thick across the sky, blotting out the moon and drowning the town in uneasy shadows. Inside the Morrison house, anger churned like a storm of its own. Carl sat hunched in his chair, shoulders broad, his face flushed from drink. In his hand, he snapped a leather belt against his palm, the sound punctuating his words. His eyes burned as he growled, "That mutt's a danger." First he goes after Dylan. Now he snarls at us. He's out of this house by tomorrow. Linda stood near him, her hair pinned neatly despite the damp heat, her lips pursed in disdain. She didn't look at Emily with pity, only with the satisfaction of someone finally ridding herself of an unwanted reminder. "Carl's right," she said coldly. "This isn't a home for burdens. You and that dog have brought nothing but trouble." At the staircase, Dylan peered through the railing, his grin barely contained. The scratch on his arm had already begun to heal, but he cradled it like a war wound, feeding his own lie with smug delight. Blaze stood tall at Emily's side, his coat bristling in the lamplight, his body rigid, eyes locked on Carl. When Carl rose and stepped forward, Blaze's bark erupted, sharp and commanding, shaking the walls. Carl flinched, then roared with fury. The belt cracked through the air, striking Blaze's side. The dog yelped, but he didn't back away. He planted himself even more firmly between the man and the child. Emily cried out, grabbing fistfuls of Blaze's fur, her sobs echoing through the room. Linda seized her moment, striding forward to yank Emily's arm, her grip cruel and unyielding. "Enough!" she hissed, dragging the girl toward the door. "If you and this beast can't obey, you'll leave tonight." Tears streamed down Emily's cheeks. "Please, he was only protecting me. Please, don't make us go." But her pleas were swallowed in the storm of anger. The iron gate screeched as Carl forced it open, rain pouring down in heavy drops across the cracked pavement. Without hesitation, Linda shoved Emily into the storm and Carl shoved Blaze after her. The gate slammed behind them with a clang that reverberated through the night. From behind curtains, neighbors stirred. Mrs. Whitaker, stooped with age, pressed her face to the glass, her hand trembling over her mouth. "Across the street, mister." Johnson parted his blinds, shaking his head. Whispers spread house to house, but no one dared step into it. In Willow Creek, meddling in another family's matters was a dangerous game. Emily wrapped her arms around Blaze, her thin frame trembling violently. Rain plastered her dress to her skin, her hair clinging to her face. Blaze lowered his head over her shoulder, his massive body shielding her as much as it could. His chest rumbled with a low growl, his silent vow that nothing would touch her as long as he lived. Thunder cracked above them and the water pooled at their feet. Emily's tears mixed with the storm as she whispered into his fur, her voice shaking but determined. "We'll be okay, Blaze. We have to be." Then came the distant hum of an engine. Headlights cut through the rain, beams slicing across the drenched street. A police cruiser rolled to a stop at the gate, windshield wipers slapping furiously. The driver's door swung open, and out stepped Officer Daniel Hayes. Tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair flecked with gray, Daniel carried himself with quiet authority. His uniform clung to him in the rain, the silver badge on his chest gleaming under the streetlight. His eyes, storm gray, steady, swept across the scene, taking in the girl barefoot and soaked, the German shepherd pressed against her side. Daniel had spent nearly a decade serving Willow Creek, a man known for his calm judgment and steady sense of justice. He had grown up an orphan, and in that moment, seeing Emily trembling on the pavement, clutching her only companion, something in him tightened. He moved quickly, kneeling beside her, his voice soft but firm. "Hey, sweetheart. Are you hurt?" Emily shook her head, too overcome with sobs to answer. Blaze shifted, a growl rumbling in his chest. Daniel didn't flinch. He extended a hand slowly, letting the rain patter against his skin. Blaze's ears twitched, his eyes narrowing, but in the man's steady presence, he sensed no threat. With a heavy breath, the dog allowed the officer's touch. Daniel slipped his raincoat from his shoulders and wrapped it gently around Emily, the weight of it swallowing her tiny frame. "You're safe now," he murmured, his voice carrying warmth even against the cold storm. His gaze fell on Blay, the dog's eyes steady and unyielding. "You too, partner." Lifting Emily into his arms, he guided her toward the cruiser. Blay padded beside them, paws splashing through puddles, never once straying from her side. As the car door closed and the engine rumbled, the Morrison house stood silent behind them, its curtains drawn, its darkness unyielding. To Emily, the clang of that iron gate shutting had felt like the world closing against her. But in the glow of headlights and the calm strength in Daniel's voice, a fragile thread of hope stirred. Blay nudged her hand, grounding her, and she clung to him as though he was the only piece of home she had left. That night, under the stormy skies of Willow Creek, the girl and her dog left behind cruelty and unknowingly stepped toward the man who would alter their lives forever. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. Daniel steered his cruiser down a narrow gravel road lined with dripping oaks until his cabin came into view, a modest wooden place worn with time but steady like its owner. It had been a home of silence for years, but tonight it would shelter more than memory. He opened the door and led Emily inside. She clutched a soaked teddy bear to her chest, knuckles white, her hair tangled and clinging to her cheeks. Her wide blue eyes searched the cabin, half afraid, half awed. Blay followed, shaking rainwater across the floor before lowering himself near her feet, scanning every corner as though he were already her sworn protector. Daniel knelt in front of her, draping a wool blanket around her shoulders. "You're safe here. he promised softly. "No one will touch you tonight." Exhaustion pressed down on her, but fear kept her rigid. Only when Blay leaned against her legs, steady and warm, did she sit on the worn sofa. She dabbed at her face with a towel, then carefully pressed it against her teddy bear, as if saving the toy from the storm as much as herself. Later, Daniel opened the door to a room he hadn't touched in years. Lavender lingered faintly in the air, woven into the quilt on the bed. Anna's quilt. His late wife's room, frozen in time, was no longer a shrine to loss, but a place of refuge. Emily slipped into one of Daniel's old shirts, the fabric loose on her small frame, and crawled beneath the quilt with her bear clutched tight. Blay circled once before settling at the foot of the bed, ears sharp, eyes never leaving the doorway. Within minutes, Emily's breaths deepened into sleep. Daniel lingered in the doorway, the silence of his cabin replaced by something fragile yet alive. For the first time in years, duty didn't feel like a burden. It felt like purpose. The morning sun spilled gold through the windows as Daniel moved about the kitchen in uniform, frying eggs, toasting bread. His thoughts stayed with the child asleep in the other room. She soon appeared in the doorway, barefoot, hair messy, but eyes softer than the night before. Blay trotted beside her, brushing his tail against her hand, guiding her forward. She hesitated at the table until Daniel pulled out a chair. "Sit," he said, setting down a plate of eggs, toast, and a glass of milk. She stared at the food, uncertain, until his quiet nod gave her permission. Slowly, she ate, cautious bites at first, then faster as hunger overcame fear. Blay sat close, his gaze fixed on every movement as though ensuring her safety extended even to the food she ate. Daniel watched, a faint smile tugging at his lips, until her shoulders began to tremble. She put down the fork, her fingers gripping the table. "They didn't want me," she whispered, her voice cracking. The words spilled out raw. The yelling, the constant blame, Dylan's cruel tricks, her aunt's venom, her uncle's belt lashing Blay for daring to protect her. And the thought, unshakable, that maybe everyone would be better off if she just disappeared. Her tears fell into Blay's fur, his soft whine vibrating against her arm. Daniel's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "That was wrong, Emily. None of it was your fault. You didn't deserve any of it." She searched his eyes for doubt but found only truth. "Sometimes I felt invisible," she whispered, "like I didn't matter." Only Blay stayed with me. Daniel nodded, the weight of her words echoing in him. He had been that unseen child once, the boy no one claimed. He saw himself in her and it cut deep. "You matter now," he said firmly. "You have Blay. And you have me." Her shoulders eased just slightly as she buried her face back into the dog's coat. Later, Blay's ears twitched. He padded outside and returned with a crumpled flyer in his mouth, dropping it at Daniel's feet. Daniel smoothed it open, an auction notice for an abandoned warehouse. His chest tightened. That warehouse wasn't random. It was a place tied to whispered deals, suspicious trucking routes, shadows of crime. Blay hadn't just found paper, he had delivered a lead. Daniel's lips curved faintly. "Seems you've got a nose for police work," he murmured. Blay's steady gaze almost seemed to agree. Emily leaned close. "What is it?" Daniel folded the paper, slipping it into his pocket. "Just something important," he said. But in his mind, the weight of it grew. This was no coincidence. The day slipped by in quiet rhythms, the kind that stitched themselves into memory without trying. Emily stood at the sink beside Daniel, her small hands clumsy but eager as she helped rinse the dishes. When a plate clattered back into the basin with a sharp crash, she froze, eyes wide with guilt. But Blay nudged her hand softly, steadying her, and Daniel, watching from the doorway, felt the faintest smile pull at his mouth. For the first time in years, his house felt less like a tomb and more like a place meant to hold life. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills of Willow Creek, Emily curled beneath the lavender quilt again, her teddy bear tight against her chest. Blaze stretched long at the foot of the bed, every sense alert, while Daniel lingered in the doorway with the weight of the folded flyer burning in his pocket. His cabin no longer echoed with emptiness. It carried warmth, vulnerability, and something he hadn't expected: purpose. Looking at the girl asleep in his wife's old bed, Daniel knew what had begun, as compassion had already grown into something deeper. Blay, loyal as ever, had nudged him onto a path that could change everything. The sun hung low the next day, its light filtering weakly through tall pines at the edge of town. The woods beyond Willow Creek were thick with unease, whispered about in children's tales and avoided by cautious hunters. For Daniel, they were part of his patrol route, but now they carried heavier meaning. That crumpled flyer still pressed against his pocket, the address tied to rumors of smuggling and hidden routes. He hadn't shared the details with Emily, but the truth gnawed at him. This trail might wind straight through those trees. Blay seemed to sense it, too. The old shepherd paced near the porch, tail flicking, ears sharp. His coat gleamed where the sun touched, but his body held tension like a coiled spring. Suddenly, he tugged at Daniel's pant leg, sharp bark cutting through the quiet. Emily, perched on the steps with her teddy, straightened immediately. "He wants us to follow," she whispered. Daniel hesitated. Taking a child into those woods was the last thing he wanted, but Blay's instincts had rarely failed. He grabbed his flashlight and nodded. "Stay close." The forest swallowed them whole. Pine needles softened their steps and damp earth filled the air. Emily clutched her bear, dwarfed by the towering trees. Blay wove ahead with certainty until they reached a clearing. There, half hidden by vines, sagged a weathered cabin patched with tin. Crates leaned against its wall, stamped with faded shipping labels. Blay froze, hackles high, a growl rumbling from deep in his chest. Daniel signaled Emily to hang back as he approached. The crates gave off a chemical sting that tightened his jaw. He brushed dirt from one label, the codes unmistakable, numbers that matched the reports he'd seen, contraband tied to a network that had long haunted his files. He cracked one lid open. Thick plastic-wrapped packages gleamed inside. His fears were confirmed. "Is it bad?" Emily whispered, trembling at the tree line. His voice came out grim. "It's exactly what I was afraid of." Before he could say more, Blay's bark tore through the clearing, sharp and urgent. The shepherd spun toward the trees, body rigid, gaze locked. Daniel caught it then, a shadow slipping between trunks. Someone had been watching. His voice dropped steady, commanding, "Back up, Emily." She obeyed, pressing against Blay's flank. The dog barked in measured bursts, a warning to whatever lingered in the distance. Then the forest stilled, but the unease did not fade. Back at the cabin that evening, Emily sat at the table with a pencil clutched tight in her small hand. Blay pressed close, nudging her whenever her hand trembled. Daniel leaned against the counter, watching. "What are you drawing?" he asked gently. She bit her lip. "The truck. I saw it." When Blay stopped at the crates. It was big, dark green, with a dent on the side. Letters near the back. Her hand moved quickly, sketching lines with startling clarity for her age. The shape took form, tires thick with mud, body dented just as she described. Daniel leaned closer, his chest tightening. The drawing matched a vehicle tied to his reports. "Emily," he said quietly, "this is important. You've helped more than you know." Her wide eyes lifted. I helped?" He nodded firmly. "You and Blay both." Her fragile smile bloomed, small but real. Blay wagged his tail once, pressing his head into her side as though proud. Daniel folded the sketch and slid it into his file. His gaze shifted to the window, where the woods brooded under the fading sun. Someone out there had seen them. The danger was no longer distant. It was at the edge of Willow Creek. But Daniel no longer carried the weight of it alone. A little girl and her old shepherd had already proven themselves more than burdens. They were allies. That night, fog clung to the trees like smoke, muffling sound and swallowing paths. The air was thick, damp, and watchful. Daniel Hayes moved carefully, his flashlight cutting a narrow blade through the mist, one hand brushing his holster. Blay prowled at his side, body taut, ears twitching at every rustle. The shepherd's coat bristled as though he sensed what Daniel could not yet see. They had returned to confirm what lay in that cabin, but in his gut, Daniel knew. This was no longer just a matter of patrol. The woods erupted in chaos. From the shadows, a man burst forward, knife flashing under the pale light. His mask hid his face, but the intent was unmistakable. The blade came down fast, and Daniel barely got his arm up to block. In that heartbeat, Blaze launched himself like a storm. His teeth sank deep into the man's wrist, forcing the weapon loose. The knife clattered to the ground as the attacker howled in pain, thrashing against the shepherd's unrelenting grip. Daniel seized the opening, driving the man to the dirt and kicking the knife out of reach. But the fight was far from over. More shapes emerged from the trees, voices low and sharp, boots crunching leaves in a tightening circle. 3 men, maybe more. One barked an order, his tone cold and precise. They had planned this. They weren't here to scare. They were here to trap. Daniel's hand went for his radio, but before he could raise it, one of the men shouted, "There's a kid in the car!" At the edge of the clearing, where his cruiser sat faintly lit, Emily was huddled in the back seat. She clung to her teddy bear, her small body trembling as the figures loomed closer. One smashed the window with the butt of a crowbar, snarling for her to get out. Another tugged at the locked handle. Emily's scream split the night. Her bear slipped from her lap to the floor as she pounded her fists helplessly against the glass. Blaze's ears shot up. Wounded, bleeding, but unbroken, he tore away from the scuffle and hurled himself toward the sound. His bark thundered through the woods, not just a warning, but a war cry. Daniel's pulse surged as he fired a shot skyward, the blast cracking through the fog. For a second, the world stilled. The men redoubled their assault on the cruiser, but Blaze struck first. He slammed into one, sending him sprawling, then whirled on another who swung a heavy flashlight. Blaze's snarl cut through the night, driving him back. Daniel was there in an instant, weapon raised, voice carrying with a command that shook the clearing. "Police!" "Drop it!" 2 froze, startled. But then he appeared, the leader. Broad shoulders, a scar etched down his cheek, beard flecked with gray, and eyes that burned with ice. He stepped into the light, voice dripping contempt. "Hand over the girl, officer!" No one else has to bleed. Daniel's grip tightened. "She's not going anywhere. She's under my protection." Blaze stood at his side, trembling from exertion, fur matted with blood, but his growl was steady, unyielding. The leader sneered, signaling his men to surge forward, but then came the sound that shifted everything. Engines roaring, sirens rising through the mist, headlights slicing the fog. Reinforcements. Daniel's earlier call, though cut short, had been enough. Backup was here. Panic broke the enemy ranks. One bolted, but Blaze dragged him down. Another scrambled for cover, only to be cut off by officers storming the clearing. The leader fought hardest, swinging wildly until Daniel tackled him, forcing him into the dirt as Blaze's teeth hovered inches from his throat. The fight drained out of him, cuffs snapping into place. When the last man was hauled away, Daniel rushed to the cruiser. He tore open the back door, and Emily collapsed into his arms, sobbing into his chest. "I thought they were going to take me," she whispered, trembling. He held her close, voice steady, though his heart thundered. "Not while I'm here." Blaze limped toward them, battered but proud, chest heaving with effort. Emily pulled away just enough to throw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his fur. The shepherd leaned into her, tail thumping weakly, his eyes bright with fierce devotion. Daniel looked at them both, the child who had already endured too much, and the dog who had stood between her and the dark. For that moment, nothing else mattered. By morning, the courthouse in Willow Creek was buzzing with anticipation. Its red brick walls and towering clock had seen generations of trials, but today the weight in the air was different. Reporters clustered outside, townsfolk whispered in anxious tones, and inside, sunlight spilled across polished wood, turning the courtroom into a stage for truth. Judge Margaret Coleman, silver-haired and stern yet softened by years of compassion, presided at the bench. She had seen endless cases of crime and brokenness, but her eyes lingered on the small girl seated near the witness stand. Emily shifted nervously, blue eyes darting across the room. Blaze lay stretched at her feet, steady and watchful, every nudge of his nose grounding her when her breath came too fast. Across the aisle, Linda Morrison sat composed, her blonde hair pinned neat, her lips painted sharp red. She wore confidence like armor, but her cold eyes betrayed something else, a glint of calculation that never left Emily's trembling form. She sat in a sharp navy suit, shoulders rigid, trying to project control, but her eyes betrayed unease. Beside her, Carl Morrison looked like a man unraveling, his flushed face and tense jaw a picture of a bully finally cornered. Between them, young Dylan slumped low, pale and restless, swallowed by a jacket far too big for his frame. When the charges were read, child neglect, abuse, the room gasped. Whispers spread like ripples in water, but Daniel didn't flinch. His storm-gray eyes stayed fixed on the bench, his presence a steady shield for the little girl at his side. When Emily's name was called, her legs trembled as she rose. Daniel leaned down, his voice calm, steady. "You can do this. Blaze and I are right here." She clutched her teddy bear and walked to the stand, Blaze padding close until the bailiff, with a sympathetic nod, allowed him to settle beneath her chair. Judge Coleman approved with a glance, understanding the comfort the shepherd gave. At first, Emily's words shook, barely more than whispers. They didn't want me. Aunt Linda said I was trouble. Uncle Carl hit Blaze with a belt when he barked. Dylan, he pushed me into the pool. Her small hands twisted in her lap as she spoke, the truth spilling out in halting waves. Blaze only scratched him because he was saving me. Carl shifted, muttering under his breath, while Linda's lips pressed thin, her composure cracking. Judge Coleman silenced them with a raised hand. Evidence followed. Medical records, a neighbor's testimony, Daniel's own report. The weight in the room grew heavy, each detail a nail sealing the truth. Then Dylan was called. The boy fidgeted, glancing at his parents before staring down at his shoes. His voice broke, tears spilling. "I pushed her," he confessed, the words rushing out. "I thought it was funny. Blaze only scratched me because she was drowning." His admission rang through the courtroom, silencing every whisper. Emily's eyes widened, her breath catching, and Blaze nudged her ankle with his nose, anchoring her in that moment of justice. Judge Coleman's voice carried firm and clear. "The court recognizes this testimony as credible. The child has suffered neglect and endangerment. Effective immediately, temporary guardianship of Emily Parker is granted to Officer Daniel Hayes." The words fell like sunlight breaking storm clouds. Emily's lips trembled, but a small smile formed as Daniel's hand rested reassuringly on her shoulder. Across the room, Linda's face blanched. Carl muttered curses until the bailiff's glare silenced him, and Dylan wept, alone in his corner. Emily leaned down, wrapping her arms around Blaze, who exhaled and pressed his head against her side, steady and calm. For the first time, Emily knew she wasn't invisible. Seasons shifted. Autumn painted Willow Creek in gold, and the echoes of the trial faded into memory. Emily no longer woke trembling in the night. Daniel's cabin smelled of pancakes in the morning, and evenings filled with sketches spread across the kitchen table. She had grown taller, brighter, her laughter chasing shadows from the house. Blaze never strayed far, his heavy paws a steady rhythm behind her, his eyes always watching. Daniel had changed, too. The grief that once weighed on him had softened, replaced by the steady warmth of belonging. His home, once silent, now lived with voices, with the bond of a girl and her guardian shepherd. The day of the adoption hearing arrived quietly. But to Emily it was the most important of her life. She walked the courthouse steps with sure feet, Daniel's hand in one of hers, her teddy bear in the other, Blaze striding proudly beside them. Judge Coleman presided once again, silver hair gleaming in the light as she read the papers. Then she looked at Emily with rare softness. "From this day forward," she declared, "you are the daughter of Officer Daniel Hayes." Emily's breath caught, eyes wide as Daniel knelt before her. "You're home now, sweetheart," he whispered. Tears fell, but this time they were warm, joyous. Blaze rested his head on her lap, sealing the moment with quiet devotion. A week later, the town gathered in the square. Word of Blaze's loyalty had spread, and now Willow Creek came not in whispers, but with open applause. Officers stood in crisp uniforms, children pressed forward in awe, parents watched with pride. Daniel's voice carried steady at the podium. Courage doesn't always come with a badge or a weapon. Sometimes it's a child brave enough to tell the truth. Sometimes it's a dog who stands between us and the dark. Blaze showed us that love and loyalty are the strongest shields we'll ever have. The crowd erupted in applause. Emily stepped forward, holding a ribbon with a silver badge engraved with a single word, Guardian. Kneeling, she slipped it gently around Blaze's neck. "This is yours," she whispered. "You'll always be our guardian." Blaze wagged his tail, pressing his head into her shoulder as the town cheered. Emily no longer stood as an orphan. She stood as a daughter, loved and celebrated, with a father at her side and a guardian who would never leave her. As the sun dipped behind the clock tower, the three of them walked home. Emily skipped lightly, teddy bear tucked close, Daniel's hand steady in hers, Blaze trotting proudly with the silver badge glinting on his chest. Home was no longer a question. It was a cabin filled with laughter, a father's love, and a shepherd's watchful heart. And in that quiet glow, the truth was clear. Out of pain had risen something unbreakable. Love, loyalty, and the miracle of second chances. Guardians don't always arrive as we expect. Sometimes they wear a badge, sometimes they walk on four paws, and sometimes they're the hand that reaches for us when we've been left behind. No storm is too dark for light to break through. If Emily and Blaze could find family and faith, then so can we. God works through love, and love is the language of everyday miracles.